Hey there, Agile Wolfpack. Welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we're building software in an agile manner day in and day out. And today, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the project paradigm and how we fund projects and what that can look like, or one might even say should look like, in an agile world. At least as we become more and more agile, we want to start moving in this direction. So first I want to talk about the traditional project paradigm. Now, a lot of times when we're talking about agility and people start talking about like traditional project planning or traditional project management, they hit a lot of the same notes, right? We talk about our ability to estimate, we talk about the level of unknowns, and I don't really want to spend a lot of time on those things. First of all, if you're listening to this podcast, I assume you're already bought into the idea that it's really hard to estimate how long a project is going to take. And of course, the bigger the batch is, the more erratic your estimates are likely to be. And I also assume that if you're listening to this podcast, we also agree that with any software project of note, there's bound to be a pretty decent chunk of unknowns. So that's not the part of the project paradigm I really want to hit on. When we think about projects, software development projects, there is an assumption that we can basically know the contents of what we're building in advance. Those of you who are doing Scrum, if you have product backlogs that have dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of items in them, then you might want to stop and think whether you really need Scrum, because Scrum is meant to be pretty exploratory. You're kind of figuring out the product as you go. That's why you only build out in sprints, and then you kind of stop and reflect. For those of you who are not doing Scrum, even if you are doing something that's more continuous flow oriented, when you have a pretty big backlog, that still tells you like you have pretty well defined ideas about this product. You have a lot of thoughts about what's going to go into it for the next few days, weeks, months, maybe even years. And I would say that this is part of the traditional project paradigm. Even a lot of quote unquote agile organizations that I work with, they still think of projects kind of in this way. It's a large, basically fixed amount of stuff that needs to get done over a fairly long period of time. And we can basically know those contents in advance. Now, even in the most waterfally of waterfallish, waterfallistas situations out there, nobody believes that you can know exactly down to the letter exactly what is going to go into a software project by the time you get to the end of it. But that's a basic assumption that we basically know what's going into this thing. By the time we're done building it, we kind of know, at least at a high level, what all's going to be in there. The other assumption is that the project has a definite start and it has a definite stop. Now, I'm not talking about deadlines. Again, if you're listening to an Agile podcast, you're probably already as cynical about deadlines as I am. We know that we are terrible at estimating how long these big projects are going to take, and we often miss these deadlines. So I'm not talking about the specific date aspect of projects, but what I am talking about is the construct. Like, we believe that one day we will be working on this project and the next day we won't be. There's a boundary. There's a point at which you can look at a spot on the calendar and say, this project is over. We've completed it. And now we're ready for the next thing, which might be another phase of the same basic software, or it might be something completely new. But a project has a start and a stop. Even if we don't nail down the dates up front, we still have that concept that the project is not indefinite. It doesn't keep going forever and ever and ever. Gonna come a day that we're gonna say this project is done. So if you take those two assumptions and you put them together, like we basically know that the box has a beginning and an end, and we know all the stuff that we want to put into the box. Even if we're willing to flex on dates, we're still kind of thinking about this as one big unified thing. There's a start, there's an end to it at some point, and that end usually comes when we've built out all or the vast majority of the things that we assume are going into it. Well, once you put those things together, then that's where some of the other issues with project management come up that we're all used to by now. That's where we get the Gantt charts and the milestones. And, if we know what's going in and we know there's a start and stop, we should be able to predict that stop, right? And we should be able to identify the risks and the unknowns going into it in advance that could threaten that project timeline. We should be able to know all those things. Again, That's not really the aspect I want to deal with today. It's not about that estimates are dumb, although they often are, and it's not about our ability to predict unknown risk, which is low. It's really more about that fundamental idea that you have a batch of stuff that's going to be built, and you're going to start that batch at some point, and then at some point much further down the road, usually months, often years, you're going to stop. You're going to have built this box of stuff and it'll be done. And then you'll be ready for the next project. When you think about software in that way, there is a certain funding model that suggests itself. Because if I'm going to spend all this time building out all this stuff, that's going to cost me some money. By the time I tally all the labor, everything I pay, the developers and the designers and the testers and the SMEs and everybody involved in the process, there's all that pay that's going into it. And then there's all the resources, the hardware, the software, even the electricity, right? That all goes into these project costs. Now, how as an organization do I justify paying what is probably going to be an immense sum of money by the time this project is done? Well, the way that I justify it is I project out, am I going to get more value out of the delivery of this project than I'm going to get for the cost? So I'm going to spend, say, $2 million on project A because I think in the long run, I'm at least going to make up that money somehow and ideally come out in the black once the project is delivered, once I have that value. Now, that can come in multiple forms. It can come in time savings. For example, it can come in the form of I've automated a job that I used to have to hire for. It might come from increased sales of the software or an increased subscriber base. But the idea is when I launch a project, I'm going to spend a certain amount of money and I think I'm going to recoup that investment. So it's sort of like buying an asset, right? If you think about, I'm going to buy bars of gold, thinking that after a certain time period, they're going to go up in value. Or maybe even a better analogy is buying government bonds, right? I'm going to buy this particular asset. I'm going to pay a certain amount of money. It's a definitive thing. And then after a certain period of time, I believe I'm at least going to get my money back, if not more so. And if you think about the kinds of assets that we buy and sell, it is a very common way to think about value, right? I want to buy something at a low price and I want to sell it for a higher price, or I want to get something at one price point and I want to be able to recoup that money or make a profit at a higher price point, right? I spend money to buy a McDonald's franchise and I make that money back with all the people who are eating terrible food, right? It all works out, right? That's the way we make money. And we think about our software projects that way, but there's a couple of drawbacks to this. One that we're already familiar with is for any software project of note, it's notoriously difficult to know what the contents will ultimately be. We might think we know at a high level, but for most software projects of note, by the time we get to the end, we don't really know exactly what it's going to look like. Sure, the core of what we thought at the beginning is probably still there, but especially when we start getting down into those lower level product backlog items, many of those are not going to be done at all. There have been some new things that came along that we didn't even think about in the beginning that are now in the software that we didn't even foresee. There are things that are not going to make it, and there are things that in the beginning, we thought they might look one way, but by the time we got to them, they ended up being very different. And so it's very difficult to know what those contents are going to be. And that's where we get into some of the agile criticisms of the traditional model, right? How can you estimate something when you don't ultimately know what it's going to be? How can you make all these predictions with the kind of certainty traditional project management often demands when the software itself is a work in progress? Not just that the work hasn't been done, but even what the work is, we're still trying to figure that out. And again, if you're on a Scrum team, your work should be very exploratory. Like we might know what we're building, maybe a sprint or two out, but beyond that, we don't know. We're going to have to get market feedback. We're going to have to see what people say, and that's what's going to dictate our next sprint goals. We don't have a roadmap that goes out for 6 months. If you do have a roadmap for 6 months, please do something besides Scrum. You don't need it. Hot take. But anyway, that's not what I want to talk about either. There is another risk of this traditional project paradigm that we don't talk about a lot, and that is with the value of the project, because it is intensely difficult to forecast in advance the value of a project. Think about how hard it is to estimate the time a project will take. Well, we know this is difficult. Even under ideal circumstances, even for small batches, estimating how long a piece of work is going to take is difficult. And then when we stretch that out to work that lasts for a year or 2 or 3, that margin for error just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? How can you possibly look at a huge body of work and say, yes, this is going to take me 2 years and 3 months? A lot of times I can't even estimate how long it's going to take me to go to the store, but now you want me to estimate 2.5 years worth of software work. We all know that that doesn't work. How much harder is it to estimate the value of that much work? You know, if I build a single feature, it's very difficult to estimate exactly how much value, especially in terms of dollars, that feature is going to bring. Please feel free to translate US dollars into whatever currency your country uses, by the way. I'm using dollars because I'm in the United States. But it's very hard to do that, even for just a small feature. How much more difficult is it going to be to look at like a 3-year software project and all the features that go into that and say, yes, this project is going to bring in $8 million for sure, or this project will definitely save us $10 million. Like, how could you possibly know that? It's incredibly difficult to forecast value. So if it's hard to forecast the contents and it's hard to forecast the value, is this a good way to think about software work? Is the project model really a good way? And again, I'm not even talking about the difficulties with estimates and milestones and Gantt charts and that level of certainty. I'm just talking about the paradigm itself. Is even the paradigm at its most fundamental level a proper way to think about it? If the contents are open-ended and the value is open-ended, what becomes of our project paradigm and what becomes of our decision-making process around whether or not to embark on a given project? What I'm going to propose is a way of looking at software work that is more about flow. I'm going to call it, as opposed to the project paradigm, I'm going to call it the value flow paradigm. I just made that word up just now while we were broadcasting. If you would like to call it something different, you are welcome to do it. I will not come after you. If you have heard a similar concept from someone else and they have called it something else, that's terrific. I am not in competition with those people. If you start your own podcast, you can call it whatever you want, and we will be good friends. But I'm going to call it the value flow paradigm. And what I'm going to propose is that we think of our software efforts not as having a definitive start and a definitive stop with a quantifiable amount of stuff whose value we can forecast. I'm going to propose that software is coming at you like a stream. Like when you're watching a movie on Netflix, you don't download the whole movie and then you watch it. Netflix gives you the movie in bits and pieces over time until eventually you have watched the whole movie, or you've watched episode 1 and then you get the bucket of ice cream because you know you're going to be there all the way through episode 13 because you've got nothing else to do that day, right? It's a stream value over time. So at any given time, your software developers are producing units that are valuable. User stories in my world are the smallest unit of value that we produce, and we are completing these user stories over time. Okay, so think about that for a minute. I want you to picture your software development teams not as people who start and eventually complete a body of work, but think of them almost like a machine that is streaming out tiny increments of value over time. So you're receiving, this week I got these 2 user stories done, so that's the value you got. Or I got this user story done, so that's the value you got this week. Next week, you'll get different value. And this value is just going to keep coming out over time. So how does this affect our funding model? Well, then we think about funding not in terms of funding a project that we hope pays off. Instead, we're paying for the value over time. So cash is flowing into this effort. Value is flowing out of this effort. Both of these flows are happening simultaneously. Think about, for instance, your electric bill. Okay, you do not buy a box of electricity. You do not buy a fixed quantity of electricity that starts and stops. What happens is throughout the course of your life, you need electricity. Sometimes you have more, sometimes you have less, but it's an ongoing thing. And you fund this progressively. You don't say, I'm going to give you $5,000 this year. Now give me $5,000 worth of electricity. What happens is you consume the electricity as you go and you pay as you go. And you just keep funding the electricity until that doesn't make sense anymore, until we all get scared of ChatGPT and we move into the mountains and we are off the grid because now we are afraid of technology. But until that day comes, we use electricity. And this is just something you're going to keep funding over time because the value is being provided to you over time. In fact, you would probably think it was a little weird, maybe even risky, if your electric company told you, we're moving to a model where you forecast how much electricity you think you're going to need, and you're going to buy that quantity from us at a set price. Like, that would freak you out a little bit, right? You're like, hey, I mean, sometimes I need electricity, sometimes I don't. Next week, I may want to switch electric companies. I don't want to buy 10,000 days of electricity from you, right? I want this to be an ongoing relationship. That's how you receive the value from your utilities. I would argue that this is a great way to think about our software development efforts, not as a fixed quantity with a start and stop that we pay a lump sum for and then hope we make that up on the back end, but rather your software teams are churning out value. You are paying progressively for that value in a cash flow, just like they are producing a flow of value. Are these two streams commensurate, right? Are you paying for the value that you need at that time? And I would say that that's the kind of discussions we need to be having about software and our investment. What are our software teams slated to do right now? And is the value that they are going to produce right now worth the money that we are going to have to spend right now? And this is always a decision that we are making on an ongoing basis. Now, you might say, well, Phil, I mean, conceptually, that sounds good, but there's no way we can fund on a feature by feature basis or fund on a user story by user story basis. My company is just too large. We don't fund that way. Okay. Well, I might respectfully push back on that depending on your given context, but let's say that's right. Well, you can still do a lot to bring that funding increment down and make it more stream-like. If user story is too small of a level of granularity, well, what about a Tameflow move? Or what about an MVP or something like that? What if you orchestrated your funding stream around those? We're going to produce small MVPs over time, and we are going to fund these MVPs over time until it just doesn't make sense anymore. And then we need to fund something else, or we need to redirect that cash flow in a different way. But I really think that this is the way to think about software and funding. Likewise, if you use a third party to build your software, very often those negotiations are around how much is this whole thing going to cost me, and is that worth the value I'm going to get out of it on the back end? I would challenge you to think about your software projects differently, to think about you're going to be paying these people a certain sum of money over time. They are going to be giving you valuable software over time. And you want those flows to be commensurate with each other. And if the software company you're working with doesn't work that way, if they're like, well, we're going to spend 3 months building your database tables, well, then you need to get them to work a different way. You need to get them to work in a way that they are streaming value to you on a regular basis. And if your own internal teams operate that way, get them to where they are streaming value to you on a regular basis so you can fund your software development efforts in a value stream way, just as the software you receive is coming out in a value stream way. What is this bias? Well, first of all, if you are streaming your software and funding in a stream, it allows you to accommodate and adjust for the unknowns because your money and your software are always running together in real time. So if all of a sudden unknowns come up, let's say you discover, oh, here's 5 features we forgot about or what have you, they just need to go into the prioritization. Are they the most valuable thing we could be doing? Are they worth the money that's sort of coming out the other hose, right? If they are, then they can just line right up as the next thing's getting streamed to you. If they're not, then you can defer them to some other time when maybe it will be valuable to fund those things, or maybe it'll never be valuable to fund those things. I don't know, but it gives us the most responsible way to control our risk when unknowns come up. It also allows us to widen or narrow our stream according to our changing financial landscape. If we're doing real well, we can widen the funding stream and ideally widen the value stream of the software we get. If we are in a crunch where we need to be maybe a little more conservative with our funding, we can narrow the stream. And the software value stream is going to narrow too. But when we're looking at all the flows of value in our organization, that may be the right call. We're looking at the value of that stream at any given time in the context with all the other flows going on in our company. You can even stop the stream anytime you want to, and you will have all the value still that you've accumulated up to this point. This is one of the things we tell our clients. You can walk away from us anytime you want, and you will still have valuable working software. Everything we've built up to that point works. It has value. You can use it, even if you decide to turn the water off for a little while. That's totally acceptable, and it's something that the streaming model gives you that the project model often does not. And then finally, and this is where it really impacts your agility, is you can change the contents of the stream at any time, because you're not thinking about your software as a big box of stuff that has to get done at some point in the future. You're thinking about, what am I getting out of this stream today? What am I getting out of it right now? And if that isn't the most valuable thing, then you just stream other things. You just put other features on top to come out of the value stream. And your funding is going to be commensurate with that. So you are always funding the thing that's the most valuable to you, and you can change the upcoming contents of that stream at any time, and it affects nothing. Oh, but that's going to affect my project timeline. You don't have a project timeline anymore. That's the point, right? The stream never stops. There's never that time that you stop the stream until such time as it no longer makes sense for the stream to keep going. You just stream and stream and stream, and then when you're ready to stop, you stop. I mean, just like you would with Netflix or your electric company or what have you. So I offer that for you to consider, for you to chew on, percolate on a little bit. I realize it can be weird. I realize that there's a whole lot more to say about the finance and funding side of things. This is where our throughput accounting friends are going to help us out. And maybe I'll do a podcast episode on throughput accounting if people are interested in that. But I just want you to start thinking about the paradigm. Is the box of stuff model really serving you well? Is my software is an asset I'm going to build and own and then hope I recoup that value on the back end? Is that a model that is controlling your risk? Is that working? Are your funding models showing that you are consistently profiting with a model like that? If it is, then sure, stick with it. You should always stick with what works. But I would offer that when we're looking at complex software projects in complex spaces, especially software projects that have to be adaptive, it may serve you a little better to quit thinking about the funding a box of deliverable stuff model and start thinking about a value stream model. At any given time, your software teams are producing value, and at any given time, you are funding that value at that time until such time as that arrangement doesn't make sense anymore. I offer that to you. I hope it helps. Thank you for listening. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.